اوكي شيخ تفضل ان شاء الله تعالى.
إن شاء الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Brothers and sisters, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to another episode in our series, Giants of the Muslim World of the 20th Century. And today I am going to discuss some of the uh, great life and contributions of another thinker and scholar. He is indeed a giant. Actually, we spoke about Muhammad Abdu, we spoke about Iqbal, and of course, we will be speaking about Daraz and Muhammad al-Ghazali and Aisha bint Shati. All of these, if there is anything common between all the three, it is the fact that all of them were inspired and nourished intellectually and spiritually by the Quran. So, insofar as they attained fame and glory and contributed to the intellectual tradition of Islam, they were able to do so by immersing themselves in the divine miracle, in the ocean of the depth of the Quranic message. Muhammad Asad was inspired by Muhammad Abdu, and he was a junior colleague of Dr. Iqbal, who recognized his greatness and, of course, invited him to embark on to first to translate Sahih al-Bukhari, and also he asked him to be with him to help out in formulating the foundational constitution of Pakistan. Of course, Iqbal died before the Pakistan was creation of Pakistan, but he was the visionary whose ideas generated and in the discussion and finally resulted in the creation of Pakistan. Okay, anyway, in this session, of course, Muhammad Asad is a deep thinker. We cannot do justice to his thought, his reform thought, his reformist ideas. So I'm going to give you an overview. This should inspire us to study this great personality in greater depth, inshallah. Maybe on another occasion we can have a detailed discussion on our three sessions on Muhammad Asad, as well as on other thinkers, inshallah. So I'm going to cover these topics: milieu, origins, and education, and of course how he visited Jerusalem, and from there his experience with the Arabs, you know, and his experience of European materialism and disappointment led him to Islam, and then he embarked on a career, and his career take him to various, to responsibilities as journalist, a traveler he was, a diplomat and thinker and interpreter, finally interpreter of the Quran, and of course briefly about his legacy. As for the milieu of Assad, of course, all of this thing that we mentioned when we studied Muhammad Abdu and Iqbal together, I don't want to repeat those. They were there in the background. And then on top of that, Muhammad himself describes the milieu he was born. It was, the context is Central Europe following the First World War. He describes it beautifully. There had been strange years, those early 20s in Central Europe. The general atmosphere of social and moral insecurity had given rise to a desperate hopefulness which expressed itself in daring experiments in music, painting, and the theater. as well as in groping, often revolutionary inquiries into the morphology of culture. But hand in hand with this forced optimism went the spiritual emptiness, a vague, cynical relativism born out of increasing hopelessness with regard to the future of man. Of course, what Muhammad Asad describes here applies to our present condition as well. Because he will be even more shocked to see. He recalls feeling that despite the differences in their political orientation, the average European seemed to have lost faith in everything other than material progress, leading to both ethical frustration regarding the instability of moral values and the submission of all social and economic issues to the rule of expedience. Actually, this situation is aggravated today. We are expedient, it has reached a pinnacle now. Of course, now there is no other way for humanity other than just abysmal depth of degradation and decay. Muhammad Asad was born in Lemberg, Galicia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's now in Poland. He was born into a rabbinical family, Jewish rabbinical family, reputed for their long tradition of Jewish scholarship, long line of rabbis. You know, his father was the only exception because he chose to be a lawyer by profession rather than following that rabbinical tradition of scholarship. His Jewish name was Leopold Weiss. Of course, the name Leopold means lion, actually. From early years, he was given a thorough grounding, even though his father was a lawyer, a grandfather, great grandfather, great grandfather, all of them were rabbis who were steeped in the scholarship of the rabbinical Jewish scriptures. But therefore, even though his father was a lawyer, he made sure that Asad gets a thorough training and education in Jewish scriptures, Torah, Talmud, and he also delved into the intricacies of biblical exegesis and Targum. You know, these are the sources, fundamental sources of Jewish scholarship, rabbinical scholarship. Early on, he mastered Hebrew, Aramaic, German, English, and later he would master Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Was able to converse in all of these languages. A restless youth, at the age of 14, he made an escape from school and joined the Austrian army under, under changed his take on a false name. But after a week or so, his father traced him with the help of the police and he was brought back to Vienna. He joined the University of Vienna to study philosophy and art history. After 2 years, once again, the same case with Muhammad Abdu, these are geniuses, became disenchanted with his formal studies and sought fulfillment elsewhere. Vienna at the time was one of the most intellectually and culturally stimulating cities in Europe. Actually, Muhammad Asad, you know, discusses the literary intellectual atmosphere of Vienna at the time. It was a period when the ideas of, fathers of modern psychology, Freud, Adler, and Carl Jung, their ideas filled the air. Even in the coffee shops, lively debates and psychoanalysis, positivism, and semantics reverberated. Asad was a fixture in these coffee houses of Berlin, alongside the most outstanding writers, artists, journalists, actors, and producers of the day. He said it was like a wine, intoxicating wine. The young minds were drunk deep and they were intoxicated by this intellectual atmosphere and the ideas that were generated. in the hours long discussions. It went on and on for days, and he was impressed by the originality of these intellectuals. However, he remained unconvinced by their final conclusions. He left Vienna in 1920 and traveled in Central Europe, taking up odd jobs. Finally, he arrived in Berlin, where, as if here by a child, luck. There is nothing luck about it. It's all the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because as Muhammad Asad himself teaches us by his deep study of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala educates us, gradually, so that we reach that stage of intellectual and spiritual realization whereby we can fill the role, the niche that God wants us to fill. So he worked as a receptionist in wire service, and he was elevated then into a journalist. Asad was a keen observer of events, and he reported he came to somehow, he rushed because all the newspapers, none of them knew the presence of the wife, Maxim Gorky's wife, the famous Russian writer and social and political thinker and activist, that his wife was present in Berlin, which he smelled that. He got that news, and he made plans, and of course he used, really persuasive method, psychological method, to get access to her and then interview her. Okay, so of course, and then that was the first article that took him, uh, that brought him to fame, to become a gifted writer and journalist. Although raised in a deeply religious family by a devout mother, like many of his generation, but although his father was an agnostic, according to him, and Asad became an agnostic. It was then that his uncle, of course, father of Asad, wanted him to earn a PhD, of course, to be, a social scientist or a psychologist. But of course, he didn't like that field, and when, of course, he ended up, being a journalist, and then, you know, not by chance, actually, it is again the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His uncle, a psychoanalyst and an agnostic, and a student of Freud, a disciple of Freud, invited him. He was the head of the mental, psychiatric hospital in Jerusalem. So he invited him. He was a bachelor and he was feeling lonely. So he invited his nephew, Asad, to join him, to give him company. And of course, he thought he would also, it would give him an opportunity to grow even more intellectually, and establish a name for himself as well. Thus, at 22, Asad moved from Europe to the Middle East, which became a decisive turning point in his life, completely turning him away to his new phase as a Muslim, Jewish convert to Islam, and then, of course, to fulfill the mission that Allah had planned for him. A restless spirit and keen observer, he realized in Jerusalem, he, he mingled closely with the population there. Most of them were Palestinians, actually. The European Jews were coming, gradually they were immigrating to Jerusalem, to Palestine. But the original inhabitants, it gave him an opportunity to intermingle with them, and he was really, impressed. Young Wais, which Muhammad Asad met Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist project, at a friend's house in Jerusalem. Of course, his own uncle was famous intellectual. So of course he's moving in those circles. Not only he met the founders of Zionism, a number of them were living at the Jerusalem at the time, and he had the opportunity to meet them and to engage them in discussions. He was impressed by his wise man's intellect and immense personal charisma, yet he confronted him with the unsettling question: what about the Arabs? What plan you have for them? How could you impose yourself on this population? They have been living here for centuries, and you want to displace them? Asad pointed out how the inevitable injustices committed against Palestinians would breed a conflict that would remain a source of trouble for the region for generations to come. How right he was. In Jerusalem, he served as a correspondent for one of the most prestigious newspapers of Germany and Europe. As a journalist, he traveled extensively, mingling with the ordinary people and discussing with intellectuals, both Muslim and Jewish. He met heads of states in Palestine, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. He was attracted by the openness, simplicity, and inner peace of the Arabs and Muslims. He has a lot to describe this, what his first impressions, which attracted him to. He came to identify the Palestinian Arabs as the true heirs of the tradition of Abraham, as opposed to the Zionist settlers. He said that these Zionic settlers were importing European materialism and consumerism and agnosticism into Palestine, into Jerusalem, and displacing the original, population who were the direct heirs of Abraham. Even though these European Jews also racially linked to Abraham, because he did not doubt that he himself belonged to the lineage of Abraham, and he even used to point out to his, look at my features. And he would, refute those who say Ashkenazi Jews are not of a Hebrew background lineage. No, he used to refute them. But he realized, because they have changed these Hebrews, even though they are coming from the lineage of Abraham, they have lost that tradition. They are Europeans, 100% Europeans, and they are not the true heirs of Abrahamic tradition. His travels made him aware of the stark contrast between the lifestyle of Europeans and Muslims, which eventually led him to study the Quran. It was there he first encountered the Islamic East and felt a powerful attraction towards his people, particularly the Arabs. In the Arabs, Muslims at the time, he saw a being for whom the outer and the inner, the Lahir and Batin, the I and the world are to him not opposite, but and mutually opposed entities, but only different aspects of an unchanging present. So there is a wholeness, there is a coherence, there is a fullness of, the outer and inner harmonize, the body, the physical and the spiritual. He would eventually attribute this wholeness to Muslims, recognizing in them that organic coherence of the mind and the senses, which we Europeans have lost. Because, whatever Europe went through, this is, you know, the so-called Enlightenment and the secular and liberal ideologies have weaned them away from that organic linkage to the spiritual tradition, which they had also inherited. In 1926, he returned to Berlin and he had a number of epiphanies, experiences. These experiences are divine inspirations, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes us. Sometimes an illumination comes. We cannot escape it because if we seek the truth, Allah will bless us. And this is a kind of epiphany. Uh, he is describing it. After 4 years of traveling throughout the Middle East, Asad began to grasp that the solution for his European malady might come from the outside. And how? While traveling in a train. This was the time, the Europe or the Vienna at the time, the Berlin at the time, was prosperous, and the people were super rich actually. They were living in abundance and prosperity, and they had reached the pinnacle of material success. So Asad recounted his moment of epiphany when he realized the restlessness, in spite of this abundance and the prosperity they were bathed in, they were immersed in, these people were restless and they did not have that inner peace. And you could see this clearly by looking at the faces. So in the train, looking around and seeing these people, they are the richest, they are super rich, and yet none of them have that inner peace. And they are filled with hellish experience. He returned home as if by chance because he had been studying the Quran. So he picked up the copy of the Quran and his eyes, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide you. His eyes fell on the following verses of Surah At-Takathur. ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر كلا سوف تعلمون ثم كلا سوف تعلمون كلا لو تعلمون علم اليقين لترون الجحيم ثم لترونها عين اليقين ثم لتسألن يومئذ عن النعيم. You are obsessed by greed for more and more until you will go down to your graves. Nay, but you will come to know. And once again, nay, but you will come to know. Nay, if you but knew it with the knowledge of certainty, you would indeed see the hell you are in. And in time, indeed, you shall see it with the eye of certainty. You are already in hell, but then in the next life, you will see with the eye of certainty. And on that day, you will be asked what you have done with the boon of life. So it occurred to Asad that the above verses offered an answer. It came as a fresh revelation. Remember what Muhammad Iqbal said, what Adamari Shimar said, that the Quranic verses have this miraculous effect. That if you really open your heart, of course, Rumi expresses it in so many words. If you really, your heart is open to receive that message, the Quranic ayah will strike you as just pierce into your heart, a light from God Almighty, and you will recognize that God is speaking to you. This is a fresh revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressed to you in your predicament. So, and here, an answer so decisive that all doubt was suddenly at an end. I, I knew now, beyond any doubts whatsoever, that it was a God inspired book that I was holding in my hand. You see how that experience, because he was a seeker of truth, he was an agnostic, but he was seeking the truth, a keen observer, and studying the events and the experiences he had been through, and and of course his heart, because if you seek the truth, Allah will guide you to the truth. He said to himself, it is impossible for a mortal to describe so accurately the existential condition of men living in the 20th century. The experience turned him from a restless agnostic into a Muslim, a convinced Muslim, a firm, a committed Muslim. He soon embraced Islam and took the name, of course, Leopold Weiss. He changed the name into Muhammad Asad. Okay, something of his earlier name is there, but translated into Arabic because he was told that Leopold means lion, so Muhammad is to pay homage uh, to his to the new prophet. The prophet, according to him, promised in the Torah and the Gospel, which he said that is still there in the Torah, even though they have tried to alter so many other verses, but that verse still remains there, where the prophecy about the coming of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So of course, he's not an ordinary Jew, ordinary person. He's a man intellectually immersed in the Hebrew scriptures and studied the Quran deeply, spending more than half of his life actually studying, immersing himself into the message of the Quran. His wife Elisa, who shared the same experience, also joined him. At that time, she was not a Muslim, but then immediately uh, she also, soon after his wife also, she had the same experience, but they were traveling together in the train. And of course, Asad tells her, did you see how restless they are, how deprived of inner peace they are, in spite of the abundance and prosperity and luxuries they are in? So she had the same experience and she also joined him, embrace Islam. Asad spoke of Islam thus: Islam appears to me like a perfect work of architecture. All its parts are harmoniously conceived to complement and support each other. Nothing is superfluous and nothing lacking, and the result is a structure of absolute balance and solid composure. This is the work of art, a divine work. And of course, he was convinced of the miraculous nature of the Quran, and for whom, Islam, no one can reform it, no one can add to it or take away anything from it because it is the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After his conversion to Islam, Asad moved to Saudi Arabia. Of course, he would spend more than 6 years there, and also he would return to Saudi Arabia often. He made a long journey by camel across the Arabian desert. He lived among the Bedouins, so he really immersed himself in the original Arabic. The Badu spoke the pristine Arabic language, so he mastered it. Of course, his proficiency in the Semitic languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, uh, and really helped him also, because these Semitic languages, Arabic included, the roots, you know, share actually common roots. Actually, many of the words have common roots in Hebrew, in Aramaic. So it helped him to master Arabic language in such a way that even some of our best scholars do not have that kind of depth. So from Taima to Makkah, he traveled, he lived, interacted with the Muslims. He stayed there for nearly 6 years, during which he made 5 pilgrimages. Alongside, he started writing for Swiss newspaper until 1934. Shortly after arriving in Makkah and performing Hajj, his wife Elisa died, and he was kind of, it was a grieving period for him. He was almost, he may have fallen into depression except for his spiritual, uh, steadfastness. During his stay in Makkah, in a chance encounter in the Haram, he met Prince Faisal. Of course, they conversed on Faisal's invitation. Asad met King Abdul Aziz, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. And of course, Asad kept his close friendship with King Faisal, and his wife Hamida would tell us later, he would marry his last wife was Hamida. When Faisal was assassinated, you know, he was bursting out. He cried and cried because he was a very close friend of Asad. King became impressed. Of course, King Abdul Aziz, the father of Faisal, was impressed by Asad's knowledge and keen mind and spiritual depth. So he took him as a confidant and, of course, an advisor or an ambassador, or if you may call it. Of course, he was sent on various secret missions throughout, you know, about to investigate the plan and plots of the British Empire and foreign powers interfering in the affairs of the kingdom. Later, he was invited to India. Of course, Indian Muslims, the eminent ones, would visit Mecca, and there Asad, their attention fell on Muhammad Asad, and they were very, very impressed by him, to know about him, and then they invited him to visit to India. So Asad, a traveler, because Asad described himself that like his Hebrew father Abraham and their descendants, he is a Bedouin and he's lifelong Bedouin. And that's the life of Muhammad Asad, traveling from, he's never settled down in one place forever. So there he goes to India and he travels all over India, different missions, different duties. He was in Kashmir, he was Punjab, he was everywhere. Next phase. After his arrival in India, he befriended some of the eminent intellectuals and scholars. There is a long, we have a series of letters that have been published recently. Asad's correspondence with these intellectuals and scholars and guests in Pakistan and elsewhere. Of course, he kept in touch with them, and these letters reveal the true, value of Muhammad Asad as an intellectual who was influenced, and he influenced others as well. Iqbal, who was senior, Asad was much younger, but Iqbal was deeply impressed, and he convinced him to continue his work on rejuvenation of Islamic thought. And it was Iqbal who suggested to Muhammad Asad that he should spend, work on bringing out, producing a translation and commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. So he was working on this project. He had worked on it for 10 years. And the manuscript, in the wake of that partition and the chaos that, slaughter, people going after each other, killing each other, this chaotic situation, the entire manuscript that we had prepared, except a few hundred pages, was lost in the chaotic. And he saw them, flying, taken by the flood in the Ganges River, Ganga. So unfortunately, he could not retrieve them, except a few hundred pages. It is published, the early years, Sahih al-Bukhari, the early years of Islam, something like that is the title. I have that, a copy of that, Alhamdulillah. And it is indeed a deeply deep commentary, intellectual commentary. In 1939, during the Second World War, Assad, when his parents came to know that he has embraced Islam, His father wrote to him, as far as he is concerned, he is dead. So he stopped corresponding, but Asad continues. He told him, look, as a Muslim, his religion teaches him to honor his parents. So he would never dishonor them, he would serve them, he would be kind to them until the end of his life, as long as he is alive. But then also, so he reopened that communication with him. He continued to, and he wanted to save his parents and his sister from the persecution. Of course, and he prepared passports for them and sent them the travel tickets, arranged for them the tickets. But before uh, they could make use of it, they were taken to the concentration camp. And of course, during the same period, Asad were arrested in Lahore by the British as an enemy alien. And of course, these parents perished in the Holocaust. Actually, this was another critical it made, and he saw that how Asad, Talal Asad, his son, recalls that the news, hit him like a shock, and he saw his father crying. After 3 years, he was released from incarceration, and of course, during his incarceration, I think it was he had a very interesting discussion because there were a lot of people there, some of them Jesuit priests and scholar intellectuals. He was the only Jew there. So this Jesuit priest and scholar intellectual asked him, you, a Jew, why would you convert to Islam leaving Christianity? Isn't it natural for you to embrace Christianity? Is a more rational choice for you? As I said, although I converted to Islam, I am willing to convert to Christianity if you answer my question. One question I have, you answer right away, I am willing to convert to Christianity. The Jesuit priest or intellectual said, yes, what is that question? Tell me, how do you explain Trinity? The Jesuit priest said, I cannot explain it, it's a mystery. You believe it, and then you will come to know. I said, no. The Islam I have embraced teaches me to reason first before you believe. That was made him silent. He could not pursue more questions. Asad moved to Pakistan in 1947 after partition. By that time, Iqbal had passed away, and he worked to formulate the intellectual foundations of the new state. But of course, this is an experience. He was working with other scholars, but his ideas, because this Asad was immersed in the Western tradition, and also he was immersed in the Quranic. He knew the Quran and he knew the teachings of Islam, and he knew the challenges Muslims world is facing in the modern times. So the kind of his idea of an Islamic state was totally different from what the scholars had, because scholars had this medieval concept of an Islamic state. For us, the state itself, there is no definite form of state. So just like Iqbal, it can be a modern democratic society, a state, you know, and according to him, the foundational principles of the Quran, they are just bare outline, and you have to fill in this outline by creative ijtihad. And Assad's idea of reform, of course, he also studied the Muslim jurists, and he came to the conclusion that closest to his this kind of enterprise is the the foundational thought of Ibn Hazm. Of course, he did not go all along with him, but Ibn Hazm has this idea that Islam is what is explicitly stated in the Quran and the Sunnah. You know, you cannot extend it to all those jurisprudential interpolations and additions that have been claimed to be integral to Islam. For Asad, that's not the case. Foundational text of the Quran and Hadith alone can be the abiding universal principle to be adopted for all times. And of course, we have to work on that, to reformulate the Islamic thought and jurisprudence, to answer, to adapt itself to changing conditions. He resigned from the position in 1952. Of course, there is a whole background behind it. I am not going to explore that because, by this time he had married his new wife, Paula. Before that, he was married to Munira, who was the mother of Talal Asad, his only son. Of course, this marriage with Paula Hamida was because Munira was coming from this, Shammara family of Bedouin background, and she was not intellectual. So he wanted someone who could help him in his project, intellectual project, and so that he can materialize, fulfill his dream of contributing and writing a commentary on the Quran. So this was one of the great. He was estranged from Munira before he married Paula Hamida, the another convert from American and Polish origin. So, because this marriage brought him into trouble because Munira had complained to Pakistani authorities, and of course, we cannot go into the background. But then, of course, that is another. His name was immortalized by his masterpiece, Road to Mecca. Of course, it is after this, resigning from the Pakistani. By the way, he was the first person to get a Pakistani passport because when Pakistan wanted to send him to represent Pakistan in the United Nations, he could not use his Austrian passport. So they had to make the first passport and give it to Muhammad Asad. But then he resigns from that post, and of course he then devotes his time to write. And the first masterpiece he wrote was Road to Mecca, which has been an inspiring narrative of his journeys. It's a spiritual biography. And it has been widely acclaimed and received all over the world, all over North America and Europe. Of course, New York Times and other reputed periodicals and journals reviewed this. Martin Kramer, a Jew, I think he describes it as a combination of memoir and travelogue. Tells the story of a convert to Islam who had crossed the spiritual deserts of Europe and the sand deserts of Arabia on a trek that brought him ultimately to the oasis of Islamic belief. Of course, he surpassed all of the, Philby and others, Lawrence of Arabia. According to, reviewers, his work surpasses all of them. And his other works included Sahih al-Bukhari. Of course, Road to Mecca has influenced so many people, attracted them, still attracting people who read them to Islam, see the beauty of Islam. I was told recently by someone who has been one of the translators of one of his works into Malayalam that when Road to Mecca came out in Malayalam, so many agnostics who had left Islam came back to Islam after reading Muhammad Asad and recognizing the spiritual beauty of Islam. His other works include Sahih al-Bukhari, the early years I mentioned, and Islam at the Crossroads, Principles of Government in Islam, This Law of Ours, and other essays. However, his lasting legacy was his translation and commentary of the Quran, entitled The Message of the Quran. Initially, he thought he would finish it in 2 years, but it took him more than 17 years. He would, his wife would describe he would work on a stretch 5 to 6 hours without stop. Was convinced of the inimitable nature of the Quran. He was never satisfied by his work. Even though he had spent 17 years, he thought Quran is an ocean, inexhaustible depth of meaning. So he wanted to follow it up with another work entitled Meditations on the Quran. He also wanted to revise his translation as well. But he passed away before he could realize his dream. Asad, who referred to himself as a lifelong Bedouin, moved from one place to another. Finally, he settled in Mejaz, Spain, where he lived there with his wife, Poland Hamida Asad, an American national of Polish Catholic descent who had converted to Islam before. He died February 23, 1992, at 91. As per his will, he was, after performing the Islamic janaza in the masjid, he was buried in the Muslim cemetery of Granada. Asad was survived by his son, Talal Asad, a famous anthropologist and author of several groundbreaking works in anthropology and social sciences. Asad has left an enduring legacy which has been recognized by Muslims and non-Muslims. In April 2008, a space in front of the UNO city in Vienna was named Muhammad Asad Place in his honor. Of course, it was attended by the dignitaries and his son Talal Asad as well. His greatest contribution was the translation of the Quran we mentioned. Asad meant to devote 2 years, we already mentioned, but it took him 17 years, dedicated his effort لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, people who think. And of course, then he cites also the verse الَّذِينَ يَتَّبِعُونَ, in honor to the Prophet, the unlettered Prophet, prophesied in the Torah and the Gospel. And of course, that ayah is there, reminding the Jews that this is the Prophet promised in the Torah. It stresses the theme of ijtihad, the use of one's own faculties to understand the divine text. The spirit of the translation is Rasul modernist, and the author expresses profound debt to Muhammad Abdu. In the foreword to the book, he writes, although it is impossible to reproduce the Quran in any other language, it is nonetheless possible to render its message comprehensible to people who, like most Westerners, do not know Arabic well enough to find their way through it unaided. Ismail Ibrahim Nawab, a professor and academic, a Saudi intellectual of a high reputation and thinker who wrote on Muhammad Asad, he testified that through the message of the Quran, Asad rose to the unparalleled eminence among Western Muslims, because no one has contributed more than Asad to elucidating Islam as an ideology and conveying its quintessential spirit in contemporary terms to Muslim and non-Muslims alike. Gay Eaton, a leading British Muslim thinker, described Asad's translation as the most helpful and instructive version of the Quran that we have in English. Of course, translation of the Quran. This remarkable man has done what he set out to do, and it may be doubted whether his achievement will ever be surpassed. Abdul Halim, who himself has put out a translation of the Quran, had similar words of praise to share. He calls Asad one of the most original translators who did the background research for himself in the original lengthy Arabic exegesis. His language and choice of words too are original. It is worth mentioning that the message of the Quran was instrumental, moved several European intellectuals to embrace Islam, including Dr. Murad Hoffman, the German ambassador and philosopher, Muhammad Nut Marston, another Swedish ambassador, uh, Mariam Jamila, the author, and Jonathan Brown, the academic and professor from the United States. Brother Hoffman referred to Asad as Europe's gift to Islam. Another scholar preferred to refer to his life as the story of an intellectual's love affair with Islam. By all accounts, Asad was a man who loved Islam and continued to serve his cherished faith until the end of his life. May Allah have mercy on him. Muhammad Asad, like Muhammad Abdu and Iqbal, called for a reform of Islamic thought. He traced the root causes of Muslim decadence to the hair-splitting rigidity of theology and jurisprudence. He said that the Islamic thought stagnated, and he was convinced that the only way to move forward was to reformulate a new theology and jurisprudence based on fresh ijtihad in the fundamental text of the Quran and sound traditions. Now we will finish by some quotes from Muhammad Asad. It was not Muslims that had made Islam great. It was Islam that had made Muslims great. His impulse for his translation of the Quran. Every age requires a new approach to the Quran for the simple reason that the Quran is made for all ages. It is our duty to look for deeper meanings in the Quran in order to increase our knowledge and experience. The Quran wants your intellect to be always active and trying to approach the message of God. God Himself dedicated this book to people who think لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And Asad bring an observation that God teaches us. If we really open our heart to the Quran and read it and observe the nature and history, God will teach you stage by stage. We Muslims have no right in our present misery to boast of our past glories, but we must realize that it was the negligence of the Muslims and not any deficiency in the teachings of Islam that caused our present decay. If the Muslims keep their head cool and accept progress as a means and not an end in itself, they may pass on to Western man the lost secret of life's sweetness. The Muslims of recent times have fallen very short indeed of the ideals of their faith. Nothing could be more erroneous than to measure the potentialities of Muhammad's message by yardsticks of present day Muslim life and thought. Just as Sheikh Mustafa al-Marawi said, it would be erroneous to see in the lie in the Christians' unloving behavior toward one another a refutation of Christ's message of love. So, brothers and sisters, this is a very, very inspiring intellectual. And of course, all of these giants we are discussing, they should inspire us. We should study them uh, more deeply, inshallah. Surely we will all be enriched and educated and motivated, inshallah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.